Dawn broke over Sweetwater Junction, like the opening of a hot oven, golden light spilling across the quiet streets. Sarah stood in her bakery, the morning's bread already baked and cooling. She'd been up since midnight, preparing in more ways than one. Her colt rested comfortably on her hip, while fresh loaves lined her shelves, their aroma mixing with the crisp morning air. "Riders coming," Mary reported from her watching post, her voice steady despite the tension. "Just like you said, they're splitting up, trying to surround the town." Sarah nodded, proud of her apprentice's calm observation. "And what else do you see?" "They're being careful. Too careful." Mary's eyes narrowed. "They're so busy watching. For traps, they're not seeing the real surprise. Just like when you're too worried about burning the bread," Sarah agreed, "you forget to check if it's risen properly." She moved to the window, scanning the approaching riders with professional assessment. Tom Carson rode at their head, his resemblance to his late brother striking. But where Jake had been cold calculation, Tom radiated raw fury. The town appeared deserted, every window shuttered, every door closed. But Sarah knew better. Behind those shutters, the townspeople waited with rifles ready. Above the streets, carefully concealed lookouts tracked every movement, and in the center of it all, the Morning Star Bakery stood like a beacon, its fresh bread smell a deliberate provocation. "Sweet Sarah," Tom Carson's voice boomed across the empty street. "Come on out, time to answer for my brother." Sarah stepped onto her porch, her movement unhurried. She carried a basket of fresh rolls, steam still rising from their golden crusts. "Morning, Tom. Coffee's hot if you'd care for breakfast before all this unpleasantness." Her casual tone threw him off balance. She could see it in his stance. He'd expected bravado or fear, not this calm invitation to share bread. Behind him, his men shifted uneasily in their saddles. "You think this is a joke?" Tom snarled. "I've brought 30 of the deadliest men in the territory." 28, Sarah corrected mildly. 2 turned back at Miller's Creek last night. Seems my reputation for hospitality isn't what it used to be. She set the basket down, the domestic gesture at odds with the tension in the air. "Last chance, Tom. Ride away. There's been enough killing." "Like you killed Jake?" His hand tightened on his gun. "He told me about you, about Dodge City, how you let a family burn while chasing glory." "That's funny," a new voice called out. All eyes turned to see a woman stepping out of the telegraph office, rifle ready. "I seem to remember those events differently." Tom Carson's face went pale. "Emma Patterson," he whispered. "The same," Emma confirmed. "The girl your gang tried to burn alive. Miss Sarah saved us that night, kept us safe all these years. And now," she smiled, and there was steel in it, "now I'm returning the favor." It happened fast after that. Carson's men, already uneasy, found themselves caught in the same kind of trap Jake had fallen into. Every window suddenly bristled with rifles. Every alley held deputies and volunteers. Even the children played their part, their practiced games having mapped every possible escape route. "You see, Tom," Sarah said, quietly, her hand still nowhere near her gun, "a town's like a good loaf of bread. All the ingredients have to work together. And Sweetwater Junction? Well, we've been proofing this recipe for quite a while." Carson's draw was fast, family tradition perhaps. But Sarah had been right about timing being everything. His bullet struck the doorframe where she'd been standing, while her own shot, fired almost casually, sent his gun spinning away. The fight was brief, almost anticlimactic. Carson's men, facing a prepared town united behind their baker protector, chose survival over loyalty. Within minutes, it was over. "You'll always be a killer," Tom spat, as Hawley's deputies led him. "Away. No amount of baking can change that." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, picking up her basket of rolls, "but I'd rather be known for what I create than what I destroy." "Speaking of which," She turned to the gathered townspeople emerging from their positions. "Breakfast is served, though I'm afraid the coffee might be a bit strong. Been brewing since midnight." The laughter that swept through the crowd carried more than just relief. It was the sound of a town embracing its unique protector, of a community that had learned to take both the sweet and the deadly in stride. "Miss Sarah?" Mary tugged at her apron. "Does this mean lessons can go back to normal now?" Sarah smiled, holstering her gun, with the same care she used in handling her most delicate pastries. "Normal? No." Inside the saloon, the four riders made themselves comfortable, ordering whiskey despite the early hour. Their leader, a man called Marcus "Mad Dog" McCall, carried himself with the cocksure confidence of someone who'd built a reputation on other men's fears. His face bore a distinctive scar running from his left eye to his jaw, a souvenir from a prison knife fight that had earned him his nickname. "Rich town for such a small place," Marcus observed, watching through the grimy window as well-dressed families made their way to church. His second-in-command, a lean, snake-like man named Jed Hawkins, nodded in agreement while cleaning his fingernails with a Bowie knife. "Bank's been doing good business with all them cattle drives coming through," Jed replied softly. "Especially on Sundays, when all the week's earnings get deposited after services." The other two men, brothers Billy and Cole Tucker, exchanged knowing grins. They'd been casing Mill Creek for 2 weeks, watching patterns, learning routines. "And our friend, the preacher?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. Billy Tucker, the younger and more talkative of the brothers, leaned forward eagerly. "Real peaceful type," he reported, clearly proud of his surveillance work. "Spends most days visiting sick folks, reading to children, that sort of thing. Keeps to himself otherwise. Town folks say he showed up about 5 years back, right after the old preacher passed. Never carries more than a Bible." What Billy didn't mention, because he hadn't thought it important, was the way the preacher moved. The careful, measured steps of a man who'd spent years being aware of every shadow, every angle, every potential threat. Such subtleties were lost on men who mistook violence for strength. Across the street, the church began to fill. Sarah Cooper, having locked up her store, hurried across the dusty road to attend services. She paused briefly at the entrance, exchanging a meaningful glance with Reverend Sullivan. In the 5 years she'd known him, she'd never seen him quite so alert. Inside the church, Sullivan began his service, as he always did, with a hymn and a prayer. His voice, strong and clear, carried to the back pews where old Jim Matthews, the town's retired sheriff, sat with his hand resting near his own concealed weapon. Jim was another who recognized what others missed. He'd seen too many gunfighters in his day not to notice the way the preacher's right hand never strayed far from his side, even while delivering the most passionate sermons. "Today," Sullivan began, his eyes occasionally drifting to the windows, "we'll be discussing David and Goliath, and how the Lord provides the means for good men to stand against evil, no matter how overwhelming the odds might seem." The irony of his chosen sermon topic wasn't lost on him. As he spoke, he noticed movement through the church windows. The 4 men from the saloon had emerged into the street, spreading out with practiced precision. Their body language had shifted from casual to predatory, telling a story as clear as scripture to those who knew how to read it. Marcus McCall's gang had earned a bloody reputation across 3 territories, but they'd never tried to rob a church before. The take was usually too small to be worth the trouble, but Mill Creek was different. The weekly collections from prosperous ranchers and merchants, combined with the money meant for the new church roof, made for a tempting target. What they couldn't know, was that they were about to make the worst mistake of their lives. As Sullivan reached the part of his sermon where David faced the mighty Philistine, the church doors burst open. Marcus McCall stood in the doorway, backlit by the morning sun, his scarred face twisted in a cruel smile. Behind him, his men spread out, weapons already drawn. "Good morning, folks," Marcus called out, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Hope we ain't interrupting too much, but my associates and I are conducting a special collection today." He fixed his gaze on Sullivan, who stood calmly at his pulpit, one hand resting on his Bible. "Now, preacher, why don't you ask these good people to share whatever valuables they brought to the Lord's house? We wouldn't want anyone getting hurt over mere worldly possessions." Sullivan's response was quiet, almost gentle, but something in his tone made Marcus's smile falter slightly. "My son," the preacher said, "I believe you may have chosen the wrong house of worship to test your faith in violence." The tension in the church grew thick as summer honey as Marcus McCall processed the preacher's words. Behind him, Jed Hawkins shifted uncomfortably, something about Sullivan's calm demeanor setting off warning bells that his partner was too arrogant to hear. The Tucker brothers had already begun moving down the aisles, roughly collecting jewelry and wallets from the terrified congregation. "Now, preacher," Marcus drawled, recovering his composure. "I've killed holier men than you for less than a sharp tongue. So why don't you reach under that pulpit, real slow-like, and pull out the collection box?" His scarred face twisted into what might have been a smile. "Then maybe I won't have to disappoint the Lord by spilling blood in his house." Sullivan's eyes, cold as mountain streams, swept the church interior, taking in positions and angles with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd spent years calculating such things. Old Jim Matthews, watching from the back pew, recognized the look. He'd seen it on the faces of legendary lawmen just before all hell broke loose. "You know," Sullivan said softly, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent church, 20 years ago, I watched men like you burn a mission church in New Mexico territory, killed the priest for trying to protect the poor box." His hand hadn't moved from the Bible, but something in his stance had shifted, subtle as a rattler, coiling. "That was the day I started hunting men who prey on the faithful." The words stirred something in Marcus's memory, a story he'd heard years ago in a Nevada saloon about a gunfighter who'd turned vigilante after a church massacre. But before he could grasp the significance, Cole Tucker's voice rang out from the side aisle. "Boss, you ain't gonna believe this," the outlaw called, holding up a yellowed newspaper clipping he'd found tucked in a hymnal. "Says here there was a shooter they used to call Deadeye." The rest of his words were lost as Sarah Cooper, seeing her chance, swung her heavy purse at Billy Tucker's gun hand. The weapon discharged into the ceiling, sending splinters raining down and chaos erupting through the church. Women screamed, children cried, and in that moment of confusion, Reverend Thomas Sullivan moved. His right hand finally left the Bible, but instead of reaching for the collection box, it swept aside his black preacher's coat in a fluid motion that spoke of countless repetitions. The derringer hidden in his sleeve dropped into his palm as naturally as a prayer. "Last chance, boys," he said, his voice carrying an authority that had nothing to do with scripture. "Walk away now, and we'll call this a momentary lapse in judgment." Marcus McCall's response was predictable. Men like him only knew one answer to challenges. His gun cleared leather with impressive speed, but he never got the chance to aim. Sullivan's derringer barked once, and Marcus's gun went spinning across the wooden floor, along with two of his fingers. The shock on the outlaw's face was almost comical. 20 years of building a reputation as a fearsome gunman, undone in the blink of an eye by a small-caliber pistol in a preacher's hand. But Sullivan wasn't done. As Jed Hawkins and the Tucker brothers brought their weapons to bear, the congregation got their first glimpse of why newspapers once called him Deadeye. "Brother Jim," Sullivan called out calmly to the retired sheriff, "I trust you still carry that peacemaker of yours?" Might need to borrow it, seeing as my own irons are all the way down in the cellar." Jim Matthews's colt sailed through the air in a perfect arc. What happened next would be talked about in Mill Creek for years to come. How their gentle preacher seemed to flow like water, catching the revolver and firing in the same motion, his movements precise as a dance, but faster than a snake's. Strike! Before anyone could blink, Jed Hawkins was clutching a shattered shoulder, and the Tucker brothers found themselves staring at splintered gun handles where their weapons had been shot clean out of their grips. 4 shots, 4 targets, and not a single life taken, though the skill behind such shooting suggested this mercy was a choice rather than a limitation. "Now then," Sullivan said, his voice returning to its usual gentle tone, though the colt in his hand never wavered, "I believe we were discussing David and Goliath and how the Lord provides the tools necessary to combat evil. Would you gentlemen care to stay for the rest of the sermon?" The next few moments in the church moved like molasses in winter. Marcus McCall knelt on the floor, clutching his bleeding hand and staring at the preacher with a mixture of pain and dawning recognition. The Tucker brothers stood frozen, their useless gun handles still gripped in white-knuckled hands, while Jed Hawkins slumped against a pew, his good hand pressed against his wounded shoulder. "Sarah!" Sullivan called out, his eyes never leaving the wounded outlaws. "Would you be kind enough to fetch Dr. Miller, and perhaps you could ask Deputy Carson to bring his handcuffs to church a mite early today?" His voice carried the same gentle tone he used for regular sermons, though the colt in his hand spoke of harsher gospels. As Sarah Cooper hurried from the church, the congregation sat in stunned silence. They'd just witnessed their peaceful preacher transform into something else entirely, a glimpse of the man he'd been before finding his calling in the cloth. Old Jim Matthews slowly made his way forward, his own revolver now drawn to help cover the wounded outlaws. "Been wondering when your past would catch up to us, Tom," the former sheriff said quietly. "Reckon most folks here deserve an explanation." "About now," Sullivan nodded slowly, though his aim never wavered. "Suppose you're right, Jim, though I'd appreciate it if we could get these gentlemen properly secured first. The Lord's house has seen enough violence for one Sunday." Marcus McCall, despite his pain, managed a harsh laugh. "Deadeye Sullivan!" He spat the name like a curse. "They said you died in a border town years ago. Said you'd gone soft, turned to preaching after some kind of—" His voice trailed off as Sullivan's eyes met his, seeing something there that made even his hardened soul quail. "The man you're thinking of did die," Sullivan replied softly. "In a mission church in New Mexico, watching good people suffer for nothing more than their faith and a few dollars in a poor box. What rose from those ashes was something else entirely. First, a weapon of vengeance, then, by God's grace, a shepherd for his flock." Deputy Carson arrived with several townsmen in tow, their Sunday best somewhat rumpled from their hurried response to Sarah's summons. As they began securing the outlaws, Dr. Miller pushed his way through the crowd, his medical bag all ready. "Open, just like old times, eh, Tom?" the doctor muttered as he began treating Marcus's mangled hand, "though I recall you usually didn't leave quite so many breathing." There was a hint of dark humor in his voice. He and Sullivan shared histories that went deeper than most of the town suspected. "The Lord's mercy extends even to those who least deserve it, Robert," Sullivan replied, finally lowering Jim's borrowed colt as the last handcuff clicked shut. "Though I suspect these men might prefer a quick death to what awaits them in territorial prison." The congregation had begun to stir, whispers spreading through the pews as the morning's events settled into their understanding. Many looked at their preacher with new eyes, seeing past the gentle exterior to something harder, more complex. "Reckon we ought to finish the service," Sullivan announced, returning to his pulpit with the same measured grace he'd shown in combat. "Though perhaps we'll shift our discussion from David and Goliath to the concept of redemption." His eyes swept the church. meeting the gazes of his flock. About how the Lord can take even the deadliest of weapons and reshape it into a tool for his purpose. As Deputy Carson and his men led the subdued outlaws away, Dr. Miller paused at the church door. "You know there'll be others," he said quietly. "Word of this will spread. Every gunslinger looking to make a name will want to test themselves." Against the preacher who was once Deadeye Sullivan, the Reverend nodded, his hand resting once again on his Bible. "The Lord tests us in many ways, old friend. Sometimes with temptation, sometimes with threats to those under our protection." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "And sometimes he requires us to remind the wolves that even shepherds have teeth." Outside, the Sunday morning sun continued. Its climb toward noon, its light streaming through the church windows to paint halos around the congregation. But now those same windows that had once seemed purely decorative took on a new aspect, carefully positioned to eliminate blind spots, to give clear views of all approaches. The house of God, it seemed, had been designed with both prayer and protection in mind. By sunset, word of the morning's events had spread through Mill Creek like wildfire in dry grass. The telegraph operator, young Billy Hayes, found himself sending an unprecedented number of messages to neighboring towns, each wire carrying the incredible news that Deadeye Sullivan, the legendary manhunter of the territories, was alive and wearing a preacher's collar in Montana. In the jail, Deputy Carson watched Marcus McCall and his men with unusual vigilance. 20 years of law work had taught him that wounded pride could be more dangerous than any physical injury, and these men had suffered plenty of both. "You don't understand what's coming," Marcus said through gritted teeth, his bandaged hand cradled against his chest. "Every gunman from here to Mexico will be riding for Mill Creek now. Your precious preacher just painted a target on this whole town." Carson's only response was to check the cell locks one extra time before heading out into the gathering darkness. The outlaw's words troubled him, not because they were a threat, but because they rang true. At the church, Sullivan sat alone in the growing shadows, the evening light filtering through windows that had acquired new meaning for his congregation. The Sunday collection box remained on his desk, unopened. The day's excitement had interrupted the normal proceedings, and now it seemed almost trivial compared to the weight of what had been revealed. A knock at the door drew his attention. Sarah Cooper entered, carrying a tray with coffee and what smelled like her famous apple pie. Behind her came Dr. Miller and Jim Matthews, their faces serious in the fading light. "Thought you might have missed dinner," Sarah said, setting the tray down. "Figured we should talk about what happens next." Sullivan poured coffee for everyone, his movements as precise and measured as they had been with the borrowed Colt hours earlier. "Been expecting this conversation," he admitted. "Reckon I owe you all some explanations." "Start with New Mexico," Jim suggested, settling into a pew. "What really happened in that mission church?" Sullivan's eyes grew distant, seeing past the wooden walls to a darker time. "Was tracking a gang called the Border Devils. They'd been hitting small towns along the territory line, taking whatever they could carry. Found their trail leading to Santa Rosa Mission." He paused, sipping his coffee. "Got there too late. The priest, Father Michael, he'd tried to stop them from burning the poor box. All it had was maybe $20 in donations for orphans." Sarah's hand covered her mouth as Sullivan continued, his voice soft, but carrying steel underneath. "They didn't just kill him. They made an example, forced the whole congregation to watch. I was young then, full of pride in my reputation as the fastest gun in 3 territories. Thought that made me someone important." A bitter smile crossed his face. "Watching good people suffer while I was too far away to help, that has a way of changing a man's perspective." "That's when you started hunting them," Dr. Miller observed. "I remember treating some of their victims in Colorado. Never knew you were the one who finally stopped them." Sullivan nodded. "Took 2 years. Tracked every last one of them down. But each time I pulled the trigger, I heard Father Michael's last words, him asking God to forgive his killers." He straightened in his chair. When it was done, I found myself back at the rebuilt mission. The new priest there, he helped me understand that maybe God had given me these skills for a reason, that protecting the innocent didn't have to mean abandoning mercy. And now? Sarah asked softly. Marcus McCall was right about one thing. Others will come. Let them come, Jim Matthews growled. Town's got a right to protect itself. Sullivan stood, walking to the window to gaze out at the darkening street. Way I see it, we've got three options. I can leave, draw their attention elsewhere, or we can stand and fight, risk turning Mill Creek into a battlefield, or... He turned back to face them. We can try something different. Different how? Dr. Miller leaned forward, intrigued. In 20 years of hunting men, I learned something important, Sullivan explained. Most who live by the gun are running from something, fear, shame, their own demons. Maybe it's time to show them there's another way. He gestured to his preacher's collar. After all, redemption's supposed to be available to everyone, even gunslingers. As night settled over Mill Creek, lights began appearing in windows like earthbound stars. But now they seemed to carry a different meaning. Not just beacons of civilization, but signals of defiance against the darkness that threatened their peace. The town had changed today, awakening to the reality that sometimes faith required more than just prayers and hymns. Dawn broke over Mill Creek the next morning with an uneasy brilliance. Telegraph operator Billy Hayes had barely slept, his key clicking through the night as messages poured in from across the territories. Each wire brought news more troubling than the last. Gunmen were already on the move, drawn to the town like moths to a flame. 3 riders passed through, headed your way, read a message from Copper Creek. One's Jake the Snake Martinez. Claims he's got unfinished business with Sullivan. Another from Fort Benton warned, Wilson brothers asking questions about Mill Creek, armed heavy, advised avoiding your location. In the church basement, Sullivan knelt before the hidden compartment containing his old guns. The matched pair of Remingtons gleamed in the lantern light, their blued steel reflecting the face of a man caught between two worlds. He'd promised himself these weapons would stay buried, but circumstances had a way of resurrecting the past. Thought, I might find you here. Dr. Miller's voice came from the stairs. The physician carried his medical bag, though it was far too early for house calls. Sarah spotted riders on the North Road, 3 of them moving slow and deliberate. Sullivan nodded, lifting the guns from their resting place. Jake Martinez, he said softly, should have known he'd come. We've got history, him and I. Care to share? Miller asked, watching as Sullivan checked the weapons with practiced efficiency. 8 years ago, before I took the cloth, he was running with the Border Devils near the end. Only one who got away when I caught up to them in El Paso. Sullivan's hands moved automatically, loading each chamber. He was young then, scared. I let him go, thought maybe he'd learn from seeing his friends fall. I'm guessing he didn't take the lesson to heart. Became worse than those he rode with. Built himself a reputation killing lawmen, always shooting from ambush. Never faced a man straight on. Sullivan slid the Remingtons into well-worn holsters. Now he's back to finish what started in Texas. Above them, the church door opened. Sarah Cooper's footsteps crossed the floor. Then her voice called down, Tom, you might want to come see this. In the street outside, 3 riders sat their horses in the early morning light. Jake Martinez was easy to spot. His silver-mounted saddle and flashy clothes spoke of a man who'd done well in his chosen profession. His companions were clearly hired guns, their eyes constantly scanning the buildings for threats. Come on. Out, preacher, Martinez called, his voice carrying the hint of a Mexican accent. Time to finish our business, unless you've gotten too comfortable hiding behind that collar. Sullivan emerged from the church, but not alone. Sarah stood on one side, Dr. Miller on the other. Up and down the street, doors opened as townspeople stepped out onto their porches. Even Deputy Carson appeared, rifle in hand, though he kept it pointed at the ground. "Morning, Jake," Sullivan called calmly. "Been a long time. I see you're still letting others take the risks while you wait for your shot." His voice carried. No challenge, just a stating of facts that made Martinez's face darken with rage. "You let me go that day," Martinez snarled. "Made me look weak. Everything I've done since then was to prove I'm stronger than your mercy." His hand hovered near his gun. "Today we end it, unless you're not wearing iron under that preacher's coat." Sullivan's response was to unbutton his coat, revealing the Remingtons riding on his hips. "The Lord teaches us to offer mercy, Jake, but he also expects us to protect his flock." His eyes swept the street, taking in positions, angles, innocent bystanders, old habits that had never quite died. "Plenty of rooms at the boarding house if you want to rest, think things through. Maybe even come to services tomorrow here. About different ways to prove your worth." Martinez's laugh was ugly. "Still trying to save souls, Sullivan? That's what got Father Michael killed, wasn't it? Too much faith in mercy?" He grinned as he saw his words hit home. "Oh, yes, I know all about Santa Rosa Mission. Been studying you, old man. Time to see if legends can bleed." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the street as two men who'd taken very different paths from the same violent crossroads prepared to settle old debts. But this time, Sullivan wasn't just fighting for justice. He was defending something far more precious than his reputation. The street had become deadly quiet, the kind of silence that falls just before thunder breaks. Martinez's hired guns had spread out slightly, creating clear firing lanes while staying close enough to support their employer. Sullivan noted their positions with practiced ease, professionals by their movement, but not men who'd stake their lives on this fight. "Jake," Sullivan tried one last time, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern, "you don't have to do this. Vengeance is a poison that kills the soul long before it claims the body." "Save your sermons," Martinez spat. "I've killed 3, lawmen and 2 marshals since El Paso. Each one died knowing Jake Martinez wasn't weak. Today I add a legend to that count." Sarah Cooper stepped forward, her voice sharp with anger. "You're facing the wrong way, Mr. Martinez. The only weakness here is a man who needs to prove himself by killing others." Martinez's hand twitched toward his gun, and Sullivan smoothly moved Sarah behind him. The gesture wasn't lost on Jake. It spoke of a protector's instinct that went deeper than mere skill with weapons. "Touching," Martinez sneered. "The deadly Deadeye Sullivan, playing shepherd to these sheep. Tell me, do they know how many men you've killed? Do they know about Tucson, where you shot down 5 men before they could clear leather? Or about that business in Dodge City?" "They know what matters," Sullivan replied calmly, "that I found a better path, same one that's still open to you, Jake. Up and down the street, townspeople had taken cover, but none had fled." Dr. Miller stood ready in his doorway, his medical bag open. Deputy Carson had positioned himself to cover the hired guns, understanding that the main fight would be between Sullivan and Martinez. "Enough talk," Martinez declared. "Time to see if you're still as fast as the stories say?" His voice took on a mocking tone. "Unless you want to pray first, preacher?" Sullivan's reply carried a hint of sadness. "Been praying for you since El Paso, son. Praying you'd find your way clear of this darkness." His hands hung loosely at his sides, nowhere near his guns. "Still time to choose a different ending. Only ending today is yours," Martinez snarled. "And I want these good people to see something clear. Their precious preacher dies wearing gun leather, not just his collar. Show them what you really are." Old Jim Matthews, watching from the shelter of the saloon doorway, saw what was coming. He'd witnessed enough gunfights to read the signs. The way Martinez's weight shifted slightly forward, the tensing of his gun arm. "The collar doesn't hide what I am," Sullivan said softly. "It defines it. Every Sunday I tell my congregation that God's grace can transform anyone. His eyes met Martinez's with unwavering calm. "Even a killer like me, even a lost soul like you." The words struck deeper than any bullet. For just a moment, something flickered in Martinez's eyes. Perhaps a glimpse of the scared young man Sullivan had spared in El Paso, the one who still had a chance at redemption. But then Martinez's face hardened, and his hand moved for his gun with snake-like speed. The morning exploded into violence, the sound of gunfire echoing off the buildings like Judgment Day itself. What happened next would be debated in saloons across the territory for years to come. Some said Sullivan didn't even seem to move, that his guns simply appeared in his hands as if by divine intervention. Others swore they saw him draw, but claimed it was faster than human eyes could follow. 2 shots rang out, so close together they seemed like a single report. Martinez's bullet cut through the air where Sullivan had been a heartbeat before. But the preacher had shifted just slightly, letting death pass him by with the same fluid grace that had made him legend. Sullivan's own shot struck with surgical precision, sending Martinez's gun spinning away along with his dreams of bloody glory. The would-be legend stood frozen, staring at his empty hand as if unable to comprehend what had happened. "Like I said in El Paso," Sullivan spoke into the ringing silence, "mercy isn't weakness, Jake. Sometimes it's the hardest kind of strength there is." Martinez's hired guns made the smart choice. They turned their horses and rode out of Mill Creek as if the devil himself was on their heels. But Jake Martinez remained frozen in the street, staring at his empty gun hand while blood trickled from a shallow graze where Sullivan's bullet had kissed his knuckles. "Twice now," Martinez whispered, his voice hollow. "Twice you've let me live when you could have ended me." He looked up at Sullivan, and for the first time, the arrogance in his eyes had been replaced by something else. Confusion, maybe even a glimmer of understanding. "Because dying's easy, Jake," Sullivan replied, holstering his Remingtons with the same careful precision he used handling his Bible. "Living with your choices, trying to make them right. That's the real test of a man's strength." Deputy Carson moved forward to take Martinez into custody, but Sullivan raised a hand to stop him. "Let him be for a moment, John. Reckon he's got some thinking to do." The town seemed to hold its breath, watching this quiet moment between two men whose paths had diverged so dramatically from the same violent crossroads. Sarah Cooper broke the tension by approaching Martinez, her steps careful but determined. "Church services are at 10 on Sundays," she said, her voice gentler than anyone expected. "And Reverend Sullivan holds Bible study on Wednesday evenings, if you're interested in learning about different kinds of strength." Martinez's laugh started bitter but broke halfway through, becoming something closer to a sob. "You people are crazy. He's crazy." He gestured at Sullivan. "You know what I've done, what I am, and you're inviting me to Bible study? Saw worse men than you find better paths." Dr. Miller spoke up from his doorway. "Some of them right here in Mill Creek." His eyes met Sullivan's with shared understanding. Sometimes the worst sinners make the most dedicated saints. But the peaceful moment was shattered by the thunder of approaching horses. Billy Hayes came running down the street, his young face flushed with urgency. "Riders coming. 6, no, 8 of them. Wilson brothers by the description." Sullivan's expression hardened slightly. The Wilson gang was notorious. 3 brothers, and their followers who specialized in terrorizing small towns. Unlike Martinez's personal vendetta, they were simply brutal opportunists who'd see Mill Creek's current situation as a chance for profit and violence. "Get inside," Sullivan ordered the townspeople. "Deputy, get Martinez to a cell, for his own protection as much as anything else." His hands moved to his guns, but Sarah caught his arm. "You can't face 8 men alone," she insisted. "Not even—" "You are that fast." To everyone's surprise, it was Martinez who spoke up. "She's right. Wilson boys don't fight fair. They'll burn the whole town just to draw you out." He stood straighter, seeming to come to a decision. "Let me help." Sullivan studied him carefully. "You've ridden with them before?" Martinez nodded. 2 years ago. Know how they think, how they operate." He met Sullivan's gaze steadily. "You spared me twice. Maybe it's time I earned that mercy." The sound of hooves grew louder as Sullivan made his choice. "John, get Jake's gun. Sarah, get word to Jim Matthews. Tell him to set up in the church tower with a rifle." He turned to Martinez. "One chance, Jake. Help us drive them off. Prove there's more to you than your reputation." Martinez caught his returned revolver, with his good hand checking the loads. 8 against 2, worse odds than I usually like. 3, came Dr. Miller's voice as he emerged from his office with a well-worn Winchester. "Some of us old-timers haven't forgotten how to fight." 4, Deputy Carson added, positioning himself behind a water trough with his rifle. The approaching riders were visible now, dust rising behind them like the breath of some ancient desert demon. But as they thundered toward Mill Creek, they'd find more than just a preacher waiting for them. They'd find a town united, standing with both a reformed gunslinger and a repentant one, about to learn that sometimes the hardest men to beat are those fighting for redemption. Sullivan allowed himself a small smile. "Looks like the Lord works in mysterious ways, Jake, ready to help deliver a different kind of sermon." The Wilson brothers rode into Mill Creek like a storm front, their horses' hooves kicking up dust that turned the morning sun blood red. Luke Wilson, the eldest, led the column, a bear of a man with a brutal face shadowed by a wide-brimmed black hat. His brothers, Mark and Seth, flanked him, with 5 hard-looking riders spread out behind. "Town looks awful quiet," Mark Wilson growled, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Maybe they heard we was coming." Sullivan stood in the middle of the street, his black preacher's coat moving slightly in the hot Montana wind. Martinez had positioned himself in the shadows of the general store, while Dr. Miller and Deputy Carson remained hidden but ready. Up in the church tower, Jim Matthews lined up his rifle sights on Luke Wilson's chest, waiting for any sign of treachery. "Morning, gentlemen," Sullivan called out as the riders drew near. "If you're looking for Sunday services, you're a few days early." Luke Wilson reined his horse to a stop, studying the preacher with cold eyes. "Well, if it ain't the famous Deadeye, Sullivan, heard you'd found religion." His gaze swept the quiet buildings. "Also heard you've been entertaining Jake Martinez. He's still breathing?" "I'm right here, Luke." Martinez stepped into view, his gun held casually at his side. "And standing with the preacher." This brought a round of surprised mutters from Wilson's men. Luke's face darkened with rage. "Should have known you'd turn yellow, Jake. Always were more reputation than reality." "Yellow?" Martinez's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Ask your brother Mark about Yellow Rock Canyon, about how he hid behind his men while they did his killing." Mark Wilson's hand dropped to his gun, but Luke held up a restraining hand. "We ain't here for old grudges. Word is, this town's got money. Bank's been doing well with them cattle drives." His smile showed too many teeth. "Seems to us that good Christians ought to share their blessings." "Like you shared with the folks in Copper Creek?" Sullivan asked quietly. "Burning homes, killing innocent people, that the kind of sharing you have in mind?" Luke's smile vanished. "Copper Creek fought back. Shouldn't have done that." His eyes narrowed. "Way I see it, preacher, you got 2 choices. Stand aside and let us take what we want, or watch this pretty little town burn like Copper Creek did." Sullivan's response was measured, his voice carrying to every corner of the street. "Actually, Brother Wilson, I see a 3rd choice." He gestured slightly with one hand, and suddenly the Wilson gang realized they were surrounded. Armed townspeople had appeared in windows and doorways, covering every angle. Jim Matthews's rifle barrel gleamed in the church tower. "You see," Sullivan continued, "Mill Creek isn't like other towns you've terrorized. These good people have learned that faith doesn't mean being helpless, that sometimes the good Lord expects his flock to bare their teeth. 8 of you against all of us?" Seth Wilson laughed, but there was an uncertain edge to it. "Ain't good odds, preacher." Better odds than Copper Creek had. Martinez spoke up. And you're forgetting something, Seth. You're facing two men who made their legends shooting faster than normal folks can think. 3, came a new voice, and Marcus McCall stepped out of the jail, his bandaged hand holding a deputy's badge. Figure I owe the preacher for showing mercy, and these Wilson boys need to learn some manners. The tension in the street could have been cut with a knife. Luke Wilson's face had gone from confident to calculating as he realized the trap they'd ridden into. His men were shifting nervously in their saddles, understanding that their usual tactics of intimidation had failed. Last chance, Sullivan announced, his hands still nowhere near his guns. Ride out now. Spread the word that Mill Creek is under protection, that here, at least, the law still stands, and mercy is still offered to those who choose a better path. And if we don't, Luke demanded, though his bluster had faded. Sullivan's reply carried the weight of absolute certainty. Then you'll learn why they called me Deadeye, why Jake Martinez was feared across 3 territories, and why a town full of God-fearing folks who found their courage is more dangerous than any gang. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shadows that seemed to draw lines in the dust, between right and wrong, between past and future, between those who chose violence and those who stood against it. In the silence, each man faced a choice that would echo far beyond this moment in a small Montana town. Luke Wilson was a man accustomed to having the upper hand, to seeing fear in the eyes of those he confronted. But looking around Mill Creek's sun-baked street, he saw something different in the faces watching him from windows and doorways. Determination, unity, and a quiet kind of courage that made his trigger finger itch. "Think you've forgotten something, preacher?" Luke called out, his voice carrying a desperate edge. "Men like us, we got nothing to lose. You really want to test how many of your precious flock we can take with us?" Sullivan's reply was cut short by the sound of more horses approaching. All eyes turned to see a dust cloud rising from the east road. Seth Wilson's face broke into a cruel grin. "That'll be the rest of our boys," he announced triumphantly. 15 more riders, preacher. Still feeling righteous about them odds?" But Martinez had stepped forward, his expression showing something Luke Wilson had never seen on the gunman's face before: amusement. "Might want to look again, Seth. Those ain't your boys." Through the settling dust came Samuel Carter, the U.S. Marshal from Fort Benton, leading a column of riders wearing badges. Behind them rode more armed men, ranchers from the surrounding valley who'd heard about Mill Creek's stand and chosen their side. "Sorry we're late, Reverend," Carter called out as his men spread out to cover the Wilson gang. "Got your telegram about expecting trouble. Thought we'd bring some friends." Luke Wilson's face had gone the color of old chalk. His men were starting to spread out, but Sullivan's voice cracked like summer lightning. "I wouldn't. Take a good look around you, Luke. Really see what you're facing." The Wilson gang found themselves in the middle of a closing circle. Jim Matthews and his rifle in the church tower. Martinez and McCall on one side, their guns drawn and steady. The marshal's men and local ranchers blocking any retreat. And in the middle of it all stood Sullivan, his hands still nowhere near his guns, offering a choice instead of violence. "Your reputation says you're smart, Luke," Sullivan continued. "Smart enough to know when a fight's not worth the cost. The Lord offers everyone a chance to choose a better path, even men like you who've walked so long in darkness." Luke Wilson's eyes darted around like a trapped animal seeking any escape. "You expect us to surrender, face the law? Hanging's not much of a choice, preacher." "Actually," Marshal Carter spoke up, "I've had some interesting conversations with Reverend Sullivan about rehabilitation, about giving men a chance to change under proper supervision." He nodded toward Martinez and McCall. "Seems to be working so far." Seth Wilson suddenly spurred his horse forward, going for his gun with the reckless courage of a desperate man. What happened next became another part of the growing Mill Creek legend. Sullivan's draw was so fast that most swore they never saw it, just heard the shot and watched Seth's gun go spinning away along with his horse's reins. The spooked horse reared, dumping Seth unceremoniously in the dust. He lay there unharmed but thoroughly humbled, staring at his empty hands. "That's one," Sullivan said quietly. "Don't make me demonstrate further. I'd rather not risk hitting any horses. They're innocent in all this." A laugh rippled through the crowd, breaking the tension. Even some of Wilson's men cracked smiles, recognizing the absurd reality of their situation. Luke Wilson's shoulders sagged as the fight drained out of him. 20 years of building a reputation, he muttered, just to be undone by a preacher and his reformed sinners. "No," Sullivan corrected him, "not undone. Offered a chance to build something better. That's what Mill Creek is becoming, a place where men can choose to be more than their past mistakes." One by one, the Wilson gang surrendered their weapons. As Marshal Carter's men took them into custody, Martinez moved to stand beside Sullivan. "You know," Martinez said thoughtfully, "all those years I spent hating you for sparing me, thinking it made me look weak. Never occurred to me that facing up to your mistakes, choosing to change, that might be the hardest kind of strength there is." Sullivan smiled. "Welcome to Mill Creek, Jake. We have Bible study on Wednesdays." As the dust settled and the town began to return to normal, something had shifted in the air. A sense that this place, this community, had become something unique in the territories. A place where redemption wasn't just preached about on Sundays, but lived out in the choices of those who'd found the courage to change. The following Wednesday evening found Mill Creek's First Baptist Church more crowded than usual for Bible study. Along with the regular congregation sat Jake Martinez, his gun belt hanging on a peg by the door. Marcus McCall occupied a back pew, his bandaged hand cradling a Bible. Even two of Wilson's former riders had chosen to stay, drawn by Sullivan's offer of redemption over punishment. But not everyone welcomed these changes. Samuel Reed, one of the town's prominent ranchers, stood up during the discussion, his face flushed with righteous indignation. "With all due respect, Reverend," Reed's voice carried an edge, "are we really supposed to sit here and study scripture with known killers? Men who've robbed and murdered their way across the territories?" Sullivan closed his Bible carefully, studying Reed with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. "Tell me, Brother Reed, what was the apostle? Paul before his conversion on the Damascus Road? Was he not Saul, a persecutor of the faithful?" "That's different," Reed protested. "These men are sinners," Sullivan interrupted gently, "as are we all. The only difference is in how honest we are about our need for grace." Martinez shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Mr. Reed's right about what I was. Can't deny it, won't try to. But the Reverend here showed me something I never understood before. That real strength isn't about how many men you've killed, but how many you choose not to." From the back of the church, Dr. Miller added his thoughts. "I've treated bullet wounds and knife cuts across 3 territories, seen the worst men can do to each other. But I've also seen men change when given the chance. This town's becoming something special, a place where that change is possible." The discussion might have continued, but it was interrupted by the arrival of Billy Hayes, the young telegraph operator. His face was pale as he handed Sullivan a message. "Just came in from Sweetwater," Billy explained, his voice shaking slightly. "Thought you should see it right away." Sullivan read the telegram, his expression growing grave. Sarah Cooper, who'd come to recognize the subtle shifts in the preacher's demeanor, moved closer. "What is it, Tom?" "Gabriel Knox is coming," Sullivan said quietly, but the name carried through the suddenly silent church like a death knell. Martinez cursed softly, then apologized for doing so in church. "Knox? The bounty hunter? Thought he retired years ago?" "He did," Sullivan confirmed. "After Painted Rock. He was the one who trained me, taught me everything I knew about tracking and shooting. He looked around the church, meeting the concerned faces of his congregation. Now he's coming to see what his student has become. McCall spoke up from his back pew. Knox is a legend. They say he's killed more men than smallpox. If he's coming, here, he's coming because of me, Sullivan interrupted, because of what we're trying to build here. Gabriel Knox believes men can't change, that a killer stays a killer until someone puts him in the ground. Like he tried to prove with you, Martinez asked shrewdly. Sullivan nodded. After Painted Rock, after I started hunting the border devils, Knox tried to convince me to join him. Said with my skills, we could clean up the territories our way. No trials, no mercy, just bullets and graves. His hand absently touched his side, where an old scar lay hidden. When I refused, he tried to prove his point the hard way. Sarah's hand covered her mouth. He shot you? Tried to. The bullet that was meant for my heart found less vital ground. By the time I recovered, he'd disappeared. Sullivan's eyes grew distant with memory. Now he's coming to finish what he started. Not just with me, but with everything we're building here. The church fell silent as the implications sank in. They'd faced down the Wilson gang, turned enemies into allies, begun the hard work of redemption. But Gabriel Knox represented something else entirely, a man who'd rejected the very possibility of change, who saw mercy as weakness and redemption as a fool's dream. When will he arrive? Deputy Carson asked from his position near the door. Message says he left Sweetwater yesterday, Sullivan replied. Giving us time to prepare or to run. That's his way. He wants us to know he's coming. Martinez stood, moving to retrieve his gun belt. If you're planning to face him, Reverend, you won't be doing it alone. One by one, others stood. McCall, the reformed Wilson men, members of the congregation. Even Samuel Reed rose, his earlier objections forgotten in the face of a greater threat. Well, Sullivan said with a slight smile, seems like we'll need to postpone Bible study. We've got work to do. Gabriel Knox rode into Mill Creek just as the morning sun crept over the eastern mountains. He sat his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent more years in the saddle than out of it, his grey hair and weathered face marking him as someone who'd survived long enough to become legendary. His black duster was trail-worn, but well-maintained, like the matched pair of colts riding low on his hips. What he found wasn't the armed camp he'd expected. Instead, the street was alive with normal. Morning activity, Martinez and several townsmen working on the church roof, McCall helping unload supplies at Sarah's store, children playing under the watchful eyes of armed parents who somehow made their weapons seem more precautionary than threatening. Sullivan stood waiting in front of the church, dressed in his preacher's blacks with no visible weapons. Only those who knew him well could spot the subtle signs of readiness in his stance, the awareness that had kept him alive through countless confrontations. "Been a long time, Gabriel," Sullivan called out as Knox reined his horse to a stop. "Not long enough, Tom." Knox's voice was gravel over steel, his eyes taking in every detail of the scene before him. "I see you've built yourself quite a congregation. Interesting mix of sheep and wolves you've got here. The Lord welcomes all who seek redemption." Knox's laugh was harsh as trail dust. "Still hiding behind Scripture, I see, just like you hid behind that badge after Painted Rock." His hand rested, casually near his gun. "Tell me, does your flock know the real reason you turned to the cloth? About the men you killed after I trained you?" "They know everything," Sullivan replied calmly. "About Painted Rock, about the border devils, about you. No more hiding, Gabriel. No more running from what I was or celebrating what I've become." By now a crowd had gathered, townspeople and reformed outlaws standing together, watching this reunion of teacher and student. Knox's eyes narrowed as he noticed Martinez and McCall moving to flank Sullivan, their hands conspicuously away. In from their weapons. So it's true then. Knox said, genuine disappointment in his voice. "You've gone soft, gathered yourself a collection of reformed killers, playing at redemption while the territories burn." He shook his head. "I taught you better than that, Tom. Men don't change their nature. A snake's still a snake, no matter how pretty the garden you put it in." "You taught me about guns and killing," Sullivan corrected. "But at Painted Rock I learned something you never could. That violence isn't the only answer, that men can choose a different path." Knox's face hardened. "Like these men have? Martinez, with 16 notches on his gun? McCall and his gang? The Wilson boys?" His voice dripped contempt. "You really think a few Bible verses can wash away that much blood?" "No," Sullivan replied. "But I believe the desire to be better, to do better, counts for something. These men aren't just seeking forgiveness, Gabriel. They're working for it, earning it day by day." "Weakness," Knox spat. "I came here to put you down clean, Tom, for old time's sake. But now—" His eyes swept the crowd. "Now I see I need to remind everyone what happens when you trust a snake not to bite." His hand moved for his gun with the speed that had made him legend, but Sullivan's voice cracked like summer lightning. "Look around you first, Gabriel. Really. Look!" Knox's hand froze as he finally registered what he'd missed in his focus on Sullivan. The townspeople hadn't scattered in fear. Instead, they'd moved to stand with their reformed protectors, Sarah Cooper beside Martinez, Dr. Miller, with McCall, others with the Wilson men. Not hiding behind them, but standing with them. "This is what you never understood," Sullivan said softly. "Redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing a different future. Every person here knows what these men were, what they did, but they also know what they're choosing to become." "Pretty words," Knox growled, "but words don't change what men are." "No," Sullivan agreed. "Actions do. These men you call snakes, they've spent 2 days helping build this town instead of fortifying it. They've chosen to stand against you without drawing their guns. They're proving every minute that change is possible." Knox's face twisted with something between rage and disbelief. "Then they'll die with their precious redemption. Sometimes, Tom, the only lesson that matters is the one written in blood." His hand moved again for his gun, but this time Sullivan's voice carried a different tone. Not the student addressing his teacher, but a shepherd protecting his flock. "Last chance, Gabriel. Don't make me show you just how well you taught me." Time seemed to freeze in the dusty street of Mill Creek, every breath held, every heart pounding in anticipation of violence. Gabriel Knox's hand hovered near his gun, his weathered face twisted with the certainty of his convictions. Across from him, Sullivan remained calm, his hands open at his sides, but everyone who knew him could see the coiled tension in his stance. "You know how this has to end, Tom," Knox said, his voice carrying genuine regret. "Everything I taught you about being ready, about not hesitating, you're breaking every rule." "Maybe," Sullivan replied softly, "it's time for new rules." The motion when it came was like lightning. Knox's draw was a blur of practiced perfection, the culmination of decades of violent expertise. But Sullivan's movement was something else entirely, something that seemed to transcend mere speed. Later, witnesses would disagree about exactly what happened. Some swore Sullivan's guns simply appeared in his hands, while others claimed they saw him draw, but couldn't follow the motion. 2 shots rang out, so close together they seemed like a single report. Knox's bullet cut through the space where Sullivan had been a heartbeat before, while Sullivan's shot struck with surgical precision, not killing or maiming, but sending Knox's gun spinning away in a move that mirrored what he'd done to Martinez days before. Knox stared at his empty hand in disbelief. "Impossible. I taught you every trick I know." "No, Gabriel," Sullivan replied, his voice gentle despite the Remington still trained on his former mentor. "You taught me how to kill. God taught me when not to." For a long moment, Knox stood frozen, processing this reversal of everything he believed. Then his left hand moved for his second gun, a deliberate, almost resigned motion. But before he could reach it, another voice rang out. "Don't make him do it, Knox." It was Martinez, stepping forward with his own gun holstered. "Man's given you 2 chances now. That's 2 more than you ever gave anyone." "He's right," McCall added, moving to stand beside Martinez. "Took me getting shot to see it, but there's something happening here that's bigger than bullets and reputations." One by one, others joined them, reformed outlaws and townspeople alike, standing together, not with drawn guns, but with open hands. Knox's eyes darted from face to face, seeing something that challenged his entire world view. "Look at them." "Gabriel," Sullivan urged, "really look. Every man here chose to change, to be more than his past. Even you can make that choice." Knox's hand trembled, then dropped away from his gun. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his expression. "It's not. Men don't change. I've seen too much." "You've seen what you expected to see," Sullivan countered. "Just like you expected me to hide behind these good people. Instead, they're standing with me, with each other. That's what redemption looks like, Gabriel. Not hiding from what we were, but choosing what we can become." There was a long moment of silence, broken only by the morning wind. Then Knox did something no one expected. He laughed. Not his earlier harsh bark, but a genuine sound of wonder. 20 years teaching you to kill," he said, shaking his head, "and you've learned something I never could." He looked around at the gathered crowd, seeing them truly for the first time. A town full of second chances. "There's always room." "For one more," Sullivan offered, finally lowering his gun. Knox stood straighter, seeming to come to a decision. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the dust. "Might be time I learned some new rules myself." The tension broke like a fever, the morning air filling with relieved breaths and murmured prayers. Sarah Cooper was the first to move, bringing Knox a cup of water as others began dispersing back to their morning tasks. The legendary manhunter looked almost bewildered by this simple act of kindness. "Bible studies on Wednesday," Sullivan told him with a slight smile. "We're working our way through the book of second chances." As the sun climbed higher over Mill Creek, the town settled back into its rhythm, though something fundamental had shifted. The legend of Deadeye Sullivan had transformed into something new, not just a story of a gunman turned preacher, but of a community that had learned to believe in redemption, to stand together against darkness, and to offer mercy, even to those who least expected it. In the end, the most powerful shot fired that day wasn't from any gun, but from the heart of a town that had learned to see beyond the surface, to believe in change, and to stand firm in the face of doubt. Mill Creek had become more than just a place. It was a testament to the power of second chances, a living proof that even the hardest hearts could learn new truths.